Hello everybody and welcome back again. Today you are going to learn how to talk about your obligations with two different structures. Are you ready? Let's begin. First, let's start with have to. If we translate literally have to, it literally means tener que. When do we use have to? We use have to when we want to express an obligation that another person thinks that it's necessarily. Look at the first example with the pronouns I, you, we, and they. We have, I have to change my diet. Maybe the doctor thinks that it's necessarily, right? It's not my personal opinion. It's an obligation that comes from an external person. Let's continue with the second example. You have to wear uniform at school. Maybe the obligation or the rule comes directly from the school, right? Now, let's see some examples with has to. Remember that the conjugation of this modal verb has to is only for the pronouns he, she, and it. Let's see some examples. He has to wear a helmet while riding his bike. Maybe the authority or another person thinks that it's necessarily. Let's continue with the next one. She has to study hard for the upcoming exam. One more time. It's an obligation and maybe another person thinks also that it's necessarily. Now, let's check some examples in the negative form. If you pay attention now, don't have to or doesn't have to, it's going to express a non-obligation. That means that if I do it or if I don't do the action, it was not necessarily. Why? Because it was not my obligation. Let's check the first examples with I, you, we, and they, or don't have to, which is, I don't have to wake up early tomorrow, so it's not necessarily, right? It's not my obligation. Let's continue with one more. You don't have to finish the project today. One more time. It's not necessarily because it's not my obligation. Let's continue with the second example, but now for the pronouns he, she, it. Remember that for this, the auxiliary it's going to change to doesn't have to. Let's pay attention to the examples. He doesn't have to work this weekend. One more time. It's not necessarily. Second example. She doesn't have to get up early tomorrow. Can you see? It's talking about now, but a non-obligation. Now, it's time to structure questions with the auxiliaries do and does. Remember that every time that I want to structure a question, the auxiliary do or does, it's at the beginning of my sentence. Look at the examples. Do I have to pay the bill now? One more example. Do you have to attend the meeting tomorrow? Now, let's practice with the auxiliary does for the pronouns he, she, and it. Does he have to participate in the event? Does your sister have to get up early tomorrow? Can you see? It's very simple to structure questions about others' obligations. Now it's time to talk about must or mustn't. It's negative form. And I have very good news for you guys. When I am using the modal verb must, it's possible to use the simple form of the verb with all the pronouns I, you, he, she, it, we, and they. It's amazing, right? So let's talk a little bit about the use of must. Must, it's also to talk about obligations, but now the speaker thinks that it's necessarily to do, or it's an instruction or a rule. Let's see the first example. You must wear a seatbelt while driving. If you pay attention, it's a strong obligation. Let's continue with the second example. Employees must wash their hands before returning to work. Again, maybe it's an obligation that they have to follow by rule. Let's continue with the next example. Drivers must stop at red traffic lights. One more time, I am talking about an obligation that maybe it's written or a rule. But what happened with mustn't? Mustn't means that if you don't do the action, you will be in problems. Let's look at the examples. You mustn't park here, because if you do it, you might have some problems with your car. What about the next example? Visitors mustn't enter restricted areas. If you pay attention, when I am using mustn't, it's talking about more like a prohibition, right? So this is the way that we are going to use mustn't. Now that you know how to talk about your obligations and prohibitions, it's your time to practice. See you next class.